You got it. Thanks so much. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you, Jeff, so much for inviting me to this event. I'm really excited about being here. I'm really excited about the work you guys are doing and hope in the future to hear more about it. And I look forward to sharing some of our work with those of you who are in the audience, and I hope it will be helpful. I'm going to start today by being just straight with you, right? Life is stressful. This last year has been incredibly stressful. And for those of you who work as first responders, whether that's in law enforcement or fire or health, it can be extremely stressful on a day-to-day basis. And this has been a particularly hard time. Now, humans can handle some stress as mammals whose ancestors had to escape from predators, hunt down their own meals, and deal with other kinds of life-threatening challenges with some regularity. We have bodies and minds that evolved to handle quick bursts of stress. For those animals, though, once the stressor is over, they recover and they're okay. And we're able to do that as well. And there are even some signs that we may be healthier when we face moderate amounts of stress now and then, that it helps to keep our bodies regulated and ready to go. In the modern world, though, many of us experience stress a lot more often and sometimes more intensely than our bodies and minds were really meant to handle. It can feel like we're expected to go at top speed all the time, constantly facing conflict, hassles, overwork, and in many ways, just impossible demands all the time. And those of you who are first responders, you may be adding the possibility of danger to yourself or others that you face on a daily basis, and that is simply extraordinarily stressful. Now, because our minds work as they do, stress and its implications can linger beyond the moment and beyond the situations that evoke it in a way that they don't necessarily do in the same way for non-human animals. So here's just one example. In studying police officers and their spouses, my friends and colleagues Nicole Roberts and Bob Levinson found that after high stress days, officers were more physically activated, their bodies were more aroused and still stressed out. And even after they went home, they experienced more negative emotion and less pleasure and less enjoyment than on days that had not been high stress days. So they were really taking that stress home with them. And the truth is, the more that we're under frequent stress, the harder it is to detach and dial that response back to give both body and mind the break that they need to recuperate. Now, today I'm going to propose, as will many others contributing to this symposium, that seeking out experiences that evoke even a little moment of awe, even if it's just a few minutes, can help provide that break and help support health and well-being. And in my own talk, I'm going to describe 3 studies from my own research that help to demonstrate some of the basic processes that might support this. And I'm going to talk about some work that addresses how our body responds during awe, and some work that talks about how our mind responds during awe and how we experience that situation. In ways that might set the stage for what Randy has beautifully called the now moments that may help us reset from stress. Other speakers today and tomorrow are going to talk more about the direct evidence that this practice can help promote health and well-being, even in difficult times. But I'll lead into that just a little bit and set the stage for that today. And I know that Jenny is going to do so as well in her own talk. Let's start with talking about what awe feels like. In an early study, Dacher Keltner, who you just heard from, and I randomly assigned people to vividly remember either a time in their own lives when they had felt strong awe or a time when they felt proud of an accomplishment. And in that case, we used pride as a control or a comparison condition. It was just a way of asking whether what we were seeing was just because people were experiencing something pleasant or positive, or there was really something more special about awe. One of the central findings was that in awe, people detached from their personal worries and concerns, and they experienced a resetting of their perspective. One of the very consistent findings in the literature on awe that was first documented in this study is that when they're faced with awe stimuli, people report feeling small or insignificant. And especially in the West, in individualist cultures, we that's like a bad thing, right? Feeling small is bad. It's feeling unimportant and meaningless. But that's not how people describe this. It's more of a perspective taking, oh, Okay, in the grand scheme of things, I and my issues and my problems are not the biggest thing in the world. And even the very serious stressors that I face are part of the context of a broader humanity. And for those for whom this is meaningful, a broader world and a broader universe. That sense of feeling small and having that perspective reset was not isolated. Many people reported feeling the presence of something greater than themselves. They felt relatively disconnected from their day-to-day concerns, the things that normally were worrying them when they encountered that in the moment. They felt connected with the world around them rather than isolated, and they really didn't want the experience to end. And when you ask people in an open-ended way, what was this like for you? They'll say, I was trying to memorize it. And one thing that's really striking about this is that we can be in these states, right? We can be in these states where we're thinking about the self in relation to the world in calming, detached, more detached ways that remind us that we're not alone and remind us that we are part of something greater. In a variety of ways, and those include mindfulness practice and therapy, which can have some similar benefits. The nice thing about awe, though, is that once you're facing that beautiful sunset or that gorgeous starry night or whatever it is that evokes that for you, the spectacle of leaves in autumn, an extraordinary human activity of kindness or generosity, whatever's accessible to you, we don't have to try so hard to let go of ourselves and our problems. It doesn't feel effortful. In these last two bars on the right, it was challenging, it was tiring. People in awe don't feel that way. It just kind of happens naturally or automatically, and that may be a huge advantage of this. Few years ago, my graduate student, Alex Danvers, and I did a few studies where we were looking a little bit more deeply at what's happening in the mind after we engage with an awe-inspiring stimulus. So let me tell you a little bit about that study and what we found. A basic principle that the study builds on is that the mind contains what we call schemas. These are very abstract mental representations that represent the outside world, but inside our minds. And it's really valuable because it allows us to kind of mentally play with, well, what if I did this? Or what if this had happened? To imagine scenarios or remember vividly events that we've experienced. But it is very abstract. So if you think now of a dog, right? The image that comes to mind may be a particular dog, but there's a very good chance that that image is kind of a composite of all of the different dogs that you've experienced. And we certainly have this generic dog image. Well, in the same way, we also have these generic images for commonly occurring events. And one that we made use of in this study is the going out to dinner narrative. And we call it an event script. So if I just say going out to a romantic dinner, most of us can call up an image of what that probably looks like for two people, right? And we won't all have exactly the same mental image of that, but there's going to be a lot of overlap to the extent that we share a culture and an understanding of what is appropriate for that kind of occasion. By adulthood, we spend a lot of our time filtering our experience through these kinds of schemas. And the result is that when we engage with the world, much of what we're seeing and experiencing and believe we're looking at is actually what we expect to see rather than what's there. Sometimes we see things that or perceive things that aren't actually there because we're expecting them to be. And sometimes we miss things that we're not expecting to see just because we're not looking for them. And we really picked up on that in this study, following a study that had been done much earlier by a researcher named Herbert Bless and his colleagues. What he had found is that when people are in a good mood, they filter a lot more. That's kind of what this comes down to, right? And in particular, he used this great strategy where he had participants come into his laboratory and randomly assign them to different conditions where they experienced a particular emotional state, either a positive state or a neutral state. Then he had them, and we did the same thing. So what I'm telling you right now is the same methods that we used. He then had them listen to a long, somewhat detailed story about a couple going out to a romantic dinner, and then ask them a bunch of true false questions. In our case, we did something very similar. We asked participants to watch a short video. It was either something called the Power of 10 that starts out at the edges of the universe and sort of shoots you in perspective down through a drop of water on a blade in the grass in Millennium Park in Chicago, and then down to the subatomic level. That was our awe stimulus. We also had a generic positive emotion stimulus that was Sarah Hughes finding out that she has won the Olympic gold medal for figure skating. I don't know how many of you are old enough or would have been interested enough to have seen when that happened, but she's just grinning all over the place and laughing and crying. You can't watch it without smiling. We also had a neutral control condition, which is just, actually it's an instructional video of someone explaining how to build a wall with bricks and concrete and showing you how that works. We then played people this story, had them listen to an audio story that had lots of detail. And then we asked them a bunch of true-false questions about what had or had not happened in the story. And the key outcome I'm going to focus on today is what we call script-relevant false items. So for example, was there a candle on the dinner table? Now, if this is a romantic dinner, there should have been a candle on the dinner table. You can see one in the picture there, right? Most of us would have that in our image. There actually wasn't in the story, though, or at least we never said there was. So a correct answer would be no. So a correct answer, no, would get you a point. An incorrect answer, yes, there was a candle on the table, you would not get a point for that. So higher scores on this particular metric means that you were saying, nope, that wasn't there correctly, even though we're asking about something that arguably should have been there for a romantic dinner. Well, this is the findings that we have from study one, and it's not a crazy exciting graph or anything, but it spoke something really important to us, which is that the blue bar in the middle, which represents folks in the awe condition who saw the awe-inspiring video, answered more of these questions correctly on average, significantly more so than participants in the other two conditions. And what this indicates is that as they listened to and remembered the story, they were more tuned into the details of the story itself, seeing it and hearing it rather than their expectations, at least to a little bit of a greater extent. In a follow-up study, we used photographs to elicit the emotions this time. The awe condition was photos of these huge panoramic nature views like the Grand Canyon and things like that. And we compared awe against several specific positive emotions as well as the neutral control condition. And again, awe was special in promoting this independence from the script. It's like people were seeing and hearing what was there rather than what was in their minds to begin with about what a romantic dinner is supposed to look like. We found the same effect in the third study as well. And when we look at the data from all three studies together in something called a meta-analysis, it's just a single analysis where you take data from different studies and combine them. We found that people in the awe conditions also remembered more story details that weren't in the event script, but were actually in the story. So for example, we asked, was the waiter wearing glasses? And he was, but that's not normally something that you would pick up on if you were really primarily focused on your script. But people in the awe condition across studies were more likely to remember those kinds of details as well. And taken together, this is evidence that awe might really help us let go of whatever's in our minds, detach from that a little bit, put it aside, and experience what's happening in the moment. And those are those now moments that Jeff talks about in the title of this session. So what's going on in the body during awe? And might this help alleviate the physical aspects of stress? Everyone's familiar with the fight-flight stress response, that feeling when you're scared, you're anxious, you're energized, right? Your heart's pounding, you're sweating, sometimes your hands get kind of cold. There's a whole host of physical symptoms that we can relate to that are the physiological flight response that's driven by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. In a lab like mine, what we can do is attach sensors to people and pick up on these responses through 3 measures of sympathetic nervous system activation I'm going to mention. One of these is called cardiac pre-ejection period. Now, this is not quite the same as heart rate, although it has some overlapping effects. In this, if you imagine, if you can see my hand, the heart contracting, this is long cardiac pre-ejection period, right? The heart's taking its time to contract within each beat. This is short. Within each beat, even if the beats are spaced the same way, the muscle's contracting really fast to force blood out very, very forcefully, just as if you really cranked up a water faucet and the water came out more forcefully. Same idea. And it's a very good index of sympathetic nervous system influence on the heart. We can also look at blood pressure and increased sweat gland activity as indicators of sympathetic nervous system activation. Now, when I first started out as a faculty member at ASU, I was very interested in what's going on in the body during various positive emotions, including awe. We brought a bunch of folks into the lab, hooked them up to all kinds of sensors, and then showed them several sets of photos, each evoking a specific positive or negative emotion. But today, I'm going to focus on what happened during the fear photos and the awe photos because they're most relevant to our conversation about stress and awe. The fear photos that we used were all still shots from horror movies, and we did something called pre-testing with folks to just find out, is this really scary, and make sure that when they're shown on the big TV screen that we have in my lab in a slightly dark situation, they freaked people out. The awe stimuli, they're the same ones that I described earlier, these large-scale panoramic views of natural settings and situations. Well, here's what happens while people looked at the pictures from horror films. All changes from a neutral baseline that we took right before the set of pictures started. We see a shortening of cardiac pre-ejection period. It's not huge, but it's consistent with what we would expect to see. We see a bit of an increase in blood pressure, and we see a pretty substantial increase in bursts of sweat gland activity during those photos. It's very consistent with an overall fight-flight sympathetic response. So here's what we saw in awe. The blue bars reflect what we saw while people looked at those panoramic nature photos. The first blue bar, the one on the left, remember, indicates that the heart muscle is contracting more slowly during each beat. So it's still pushing the blood out, just not quite so forcefully and frantically. This is the opposite of the fight-flight response and suggests soothing instead of withdrawal of sympathetic activation. And we see the same thing in the other measures as well. So we see a slight decrease in mean arterial pressure. That's the opposite of the stress response. And we see a far lower number of bursts of sweat gland activity. You can't have negative sweat gland activity, but this is pretty much at its floor, so that's not responding. You might wonder what happened in the other positive emotions. Were they relaxing for the body as well? Not so much. In most cases, they were also actually very activating. And if you think about it, we often feel positive emotion when there's a reward, whether it's a social, personal, human reward or a material reward. It's something that we want to go toward, right? We're prepared to exert some energy to move toward whatever that thing is. And in some cases, you actually see a response that looks like the stress response, those red bars on the left. But this is the opposite of that. And if I'm looking for a way to dial down from intense stress, my money's on either a good hard workout or awe or both. Now, in the 1990s, researchers Susan Folkman and Judy Moskowitz began to uncover the implications of positive now moments like these for well-being, even in the face of great stress. They were doing a long-term study of caregivers, usually people's partners of men who had AIDS. And at the time, AIDS was a death sentence. This meant supporting your loved one through a long, excruciating illness and knowing that there was very little likelihood that they would survive afterwards. And Folkman and Moskowitz were asking a lot of questions about stress. They were working at UC San Francisco, right in the epicenter of this. And they were asking about all the hard things and the negative affect and the pain of going through this experience. But eventually the caregivers started saying, hey, why don't you ask us about the good times? We still have good times. We still have beautiful moments, and we want to talk about those too. So as good researchers they did, they started asking those questions and taking some systematic quantitative measures over time as well. And one of the things that they learned was that caregivers who reported taking a little bit of time in the day on a regular basis to savor something that was pleasant or beautiful or meaningful also reported better health, mental health and well-being, even through this really hard time. And in multiple studies of my own, I've also found that people who deal with stress in part by savoring positive moments even a cup of coffee. For a lot of us, it can serve that purpose, right? But awe moments can be very effective for this as well, can help show better mental health and well-being. So now you might be thinking, awesome, awe moments help us take a break from stress. I'll just pop over to the Grand Canyon after work each day, no problem. For a long time, emotion researchers, like lay people, assumed that you could only experience awe when you see these major, extraordinary scenes for the first time. And I don't know about you, I can't just kind of fluff off and see the northern lights, over in Finland anytime I've had a bad day. But I tell you, I've asked people, tell me about a time when you felt awe, and read their answers. People find awe everywhere, in nature, music, works of art, the actions of other people in life. For the last year, I've been in San Francisco during the pandemic. And like many people, I have barely left the city for 14 months, barely my neighborhood. So I had to look with different eyes to find awe, but I found so much to inspire those little awe moments that makes a difference. What I had to do, though, was go to the places where I might find it and really look closely enough and put aside the things that were stressing me out to see what was there. These are just a few of the moments I've tripped over during the past year and change in and around San Francisco, and I swear they have kept me going through a really hard year. This one was a surprise in a drive along the California coast. Dozens of people had pulled off to the side of the road just to walk through this beauty and take pictures. This was a rough day. This one started at 8 a.m. with awe and then turned to 10 a.m. when I realized it was not a sunrise that was going on for a long time, and then just kept back and forth between awe and horror for the rest of the day. This was the day of the wildfires creating those vivid red skies in San Francisco. Wildlife is amazing for inspiring awe. I met this dude on the left strolling along the beach one day, and we were each like, what are you doing here? Looking at each other. And then my husband last spring put up a hummingbird feeder, and the bird's behavior amazed us just over and over again. I had no idea there were bison in Golden Gate Park. I found that out. And the humans I met and the things that they did and created to help others get through this situation with their sanity intact were really just beautiful. Even in the city, a close look at plants that are all around us can bring tremendous opportunities for awe, parks, neighbors. Some awe stimuli are very small. In San Francisco, there are little verge plots like 2 feet wide, between the sidewalk and the street. And people often do something fun with them. They'll landscape the ones that are in front of their house. And I had no idea people did this with such care and imagination. These folks actually created little scenes in their plots, and we're even updating them for the holidays. And it was fun to watch them go from time to time. People create little drops of art here and there throughout the city that are completely awe-inspiring. These are actually painted on the sidewalk, but look completely three-dimensional, even up close. And looking even smaller, there are surprises to be found everywhere. No matter what, looking out into the sunrise, the sunset, the stars in the night sky always gives an opportunity for awe. It's true that the colors and lights are beautiful, but it's really what's remembering out there beyond our brief, small lives that we will never fully understand. That is what has the potential to evoke awe and just give us that little moment's peace. So I want to thank you, Jeff, all of my colleagues. I want to thank you and the audience for all of the good and hard work that you do. And I look forward to Jenny's talk and then to chatting about the panelist questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Jenny, Dr. Jennifer Steller, I'll turn it over to you and look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just share my screen with you all here. Okay, so I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Jeff, for organizing and for inviting me to virtually engage with you all about awe. So in this talk, I want to continue to bring a health perspective to our understanding of awe. As Lani mentioned, this year has been a really hard year for all of us, especially for you all out there who are first responders. And I think it's really important that we dedicate some time to think about how we can promote or even maintain our physical health. And I believe that awe is one pathway towards better physical health. And in this talk, I'm going to show you some of the biological evidence that I have behind this claim, and hopefully give you some data-driven advice for how awe can improve your own health. Now, in order to explain some of awe's impact on health, I am going to introduce you to some potentially new terms that represent important parts of our body and our brain. but I'll walk you through them slowly and I'll highlight their functions so that you understand why they're important to awe and to physical health. Partially, I'm doing this because I want you to understand how awe relates to health at a deeper level, but I also want you to see the really amazing level of biological science behind these findings that are happening in Lani's lab, my lab, and in labs all across the country and even beyond. So in this talk, I'm going to highlight how feeling awe relates to 3 biological outcomes: immune functioning, the body, and the brain. Now, you might be asking yourselves, why would awe have an effect on physical health? I think Lani gave us some really important insights into why that might be the case, and I'll expand on them here. So we are starting to understand the really powerful effect of positive emotions on physical health, and especially specific positive emotions like awe. And as you all know, awe experiences that we have out in nature, hearing beautiful music, maybe seeing art or meditating, those experiences are inherently very fulfilling. But there are some qualities of awe that make it specifically really well suited to promoting physical health that I wanted to bring to your attention. So you'll hear a lot today and tomorrow about how awe promotes well-being. And obviously we know there's a link between mental health and physical health. So by promoting your mental health, you can also improve your physical health. We also know that awe creates a sense of interconnection with other people. Lani's done some great work in this area showing that we feel connected to other people and maybe even to humanity as a whole. And that's obviously really important, especially in this time where many of us had been separated from people that we really care about. Lastly, awe seems to have this really interesting feature. It's hard to describe, but I talk about it as this idea that when we're feeling awe, we kind of zoom out and see the world from a different perspective. We're able to maybe pull ourselves out of our daily stressors and see the bigger picture and the grander design that we fit in. And those feelings might be able to impact our mental and our physical health. So let me get into the first component I wanted to talk about today, which is on the immune system. As you all know, immunity is really important. Our immune systems need to function well. And I want to introduce you to a strange little picture on the left. It's got some red squiggly lines, but it's a representation of something called a pro-inflammatory cytokine. And that name might sound really intimidating, but what you need to know is that this little protein that I've shown you here in this picture is one that promotes inflammation in the body, and it gives rise to symptoms that you would probably recognize, like fever, fatigue, even pain, which you can see I've pictured on the right. And pro-inflammatory cytokines are actually a natural part of the body's mobilization response to a specific problem. So they're useful for promoting inflammation and our body's immune response to illness or injury or infection. Now, the problem arises that when these pro-inflammatory cytokines are elevated over time, which can happen for some people, they lead to chronic inflammation, and it's not very good for your body. And it starts to have harmful effects. So past work has found that elevated levels, chronically elevated levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines contribute to diabetes, to cardiovascular disease, and to depression. And some of these outcomes are elevated in first responders. And so looking at the pathway to immune functioning may be really important. So what you need to know is that essentially without an illness, an injury, or infection, you really don't want these little proteins floating around your body. Now, we wanted to understand whether awe might be related to immune functioning through these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And specifically, we wondered whether people who are more likely to feel awe would have lower levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines in their body. And past work has shown that negative emotions, and especially stress, are associated with elevated chronic levels of this damaging biomarker. So it isn't too hard to imagine that positive emotions might be associated with lower levels. But until our work, no studies had really investigated the link between positive emotions, especially emotions like awe, and levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So that's what we set out to do in one of our studies. We brought in a healthy group of undergraduate students to take part in our study. They filled out a survey that asked them about their tendency to experience awe in their daily lives. So you can think about this as how prone people are to experiencing awe. And then we collected a sample of their saliva in the lab, and we measured the levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So thanks to some scientific advances, we can now collect this kind of important biological information quite easily through saliva, and then we can distill it down in our sample to identify the levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines that an individual has in their body. Now, I should say that these students were not sick, so we can assume that whatever levels we were finding in their body pretty much reflect, their chronic levels, their stable levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So what we found in this study was that those who feel more awe, who reported feeling more awe, had lower levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines circulating around their body. And again, this is a healthy sample. We would expect that lower levels are better. Obviously, when you're ill, you might see an elevated level, but for these healthy participants, we don't want to see elevated levels. So this is a good sign. And so what we're finding is that the tendency to feel greater awe is associated with better immune functioning. Now, these findings are some of the first, so they need to be replicated, and they're only correlational, but we are trying now in our current work to see if we can manipulate experiences of awe, make people feel this emotion, and see if we can actively reduce the presence of this damaging biomarker as a potential intervention. Okay, so I want to move on to another component of health that I think is really important, which is the body. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which controls your heart rate, breathing, digestion, so on. And Lani did a great job introducing one component of this autonomic nervous system, and that's the sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic branch, which is important for this fight or flight response when you are prepared to face a stressor in your environment. But there's also another system I want to focus a little bit more on in my talk, which is the one I've shown you here on the right, this rest and digest system. And this is called the rest and digest system because it's associated with kind of calm or peaceful or relaxed states in the body. And as I said, this is the part I'm going to focus on today in thinking about awe's relationship to the body. So the main component of the rest and digest system is a nerve called the vagus nerve. And there's a sort of interesting looking picture to the right of this. I wanted to show you that it comes down from the brain and really travels throughout your body. It innervates your stomach, your larynx, but importantly, your heart, and it slows your heart down. Now, past work has suggested that having a chronic higher vagal activation or activation of this vagus nerve is an important marker for good health outcomes like lower risk of hypertension or coronary cardiac issues, and even potentially faster recovery from surgery. So this is something that, if we can cultivate this elevated activity in this vagus nerve is something that we would want to do. And so in one study, we wanted to look at awe's relationship to this specific element of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so we had our undergraduates like Lani's come in and they were connected to physiological measures, which you can see pictured here. And then we had them watch an awe-inspiring video. We chose to focus on one where people saw Earth and then zoomed out into space. And throughout this whole time, we measured a non-invasive index of their vagal nerve activation. And in our study, what we found was that inducing awe was associated with increased vagal activation. And I do want to mention that these findings are, one of many people have looked at, virtual reality environments, which are really interesting and find these effects, but they don't always find them. So it's something we need to study more to find out overall where the boundaries of this effect are. For us, we find that it does relate to how positive people's awe experiences are. So I told you we had a video of awe or a video of space rather, and zooming out. Some people found this awe-inspiring and really exciting, and they felt, how amazing this is to be part of this large, vast space. Other people felt awe, but they also felt a little bit fearful and maybe insignificant as this little pale blue dot in vast space. And what we found is that the more people had these sort of positive experiences with awe, the better it was for their vagal functioning. So that may be a really important element, is really leaning into those positive awe experiences for your health. And so there's, a lot of really interesting work in this area. And I think we should pursue the question of whether awe can promote better cardiac health and thereby influence how your body is functioning. Now, I wanted to finish up with one final component and talk a little bit about the neuroscience of awe and make the case that awe is associated with activation of the brain in a way that promotes a greater outward focus and less internal focus on the self, which may offer benefits for physical and certainly mental health. I do want to state up front that I'm not a neuroscientist, so I will be highlighting a study from another laboratory that's demonstrated the effects of awe on the brain, but I think this work is really important for us to think about when we're considering the biological implications of feeling awe. So recently, researchers have become interested in a neural network called the default mode network. I've pictured it here on the left for those of you who want to nerd out on brain photos. But this network is active when people seem to be evaluating their progress towards certain personal goals, or even when they're just thinking about memories from the past or thinking about what they might want to do in the future. So you can think about this network as active when we're just sitting around and letting our minds wander. Many of us end up considering past and future events. And so interestingly, there's some past work that's identified this area shows reduced activation or less activation when we're really deeply engaged in an activity that focuses us outwards. So you might have heard of these as flow states, but when we're really like in our zone, maybe you're playing a sport or playing an instrument, it happens often when people are meditating, for example. And the idea is that when we're absorbed in something else besides the ego or the self, we become obviously less involved in our internal world, and it shifts our attention outwards. And so, critically, it's thought to be less active when we're focused outward. So the default mode network processes information from this sort of more egocentric point of view. And the researchers' question was whether awe might reduce this egocentric point of view and reduce activation in the default mode network. So in a study my colleagues ran, participants watched videos of nature scenes, especially beautiful nature scenes. And this was done while they were in the fMRI and their brain activity was being recorded. And what the researchers found was that, in fact, inducing awe, making participants have this experience in the lab, reduced activation in the default mode network. Now, I don't want to insinuate that activation in the default network is bad, but it does seem that there are moments when it's useful to really be focused outward, externally, away from the self, and that those moments can help promote greater connection with other people and perhaps a more healthy outlook on the world. So this work shows that feeling awe does seem to change neural patterns, focusing the mind outward. So in summary, we see that awe has these really powerful effects on deeply rooted biological pathways in the immune system, in the body, and even in the brain. And I hope that this convinces you that this study of awe isn't just something that's happening in our minds, but it's really affecting our bodies. And so I want to end with some data-driven suggestions. Many of these actually, interestingly, are suggestions that Lani had, but I think they're worth reiterating because they're really important. So first of all, I really hope through this symposium, you can be convinced that awe is not a luxury. I hope I can show you that it's important for your physical health, but certainly it's also important for your mental health. Going out in nature, going on trips, going to concerts, they may feel like luxuries that we can afford when we're really busy, but I would say that you should build those experiences into your daily lives or your lives in general in order to promote awe. Also, actively seek out awe. Sometimes we're lucky and awe experiences happen to us, but most of us feel awe from experiences we go out and have. So if you feel awe from music, go to a concert. If you feel awe in nature, go for a walk. And lastly, find awe in the everyday. So this is a picture I took of the park near my house in Toronto during the fall foliage change. And you can see here, it's incredibly beautiful, and it's not a hard thing for me to do in my daily life to take 10 minutes out of my work schedule and go for a little walk. So the extent that you can find awe in these everyday experiences, nature around your house, for example, or beautiful sunsets, do try to do that because it is a way to maintain and potentially cultivate your physical health. With that, I wanted to thank you for listening. And again, thank Jeff for hosting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Steller. Let's jump right into our expert panelists. First, we're going to have Chief Neil Gang. He's the Chief of Police for Pinole Police Department in California. So from your perspective, share maybe some of your thoughts and provide one question, I believe, for Dr. Shiota, right?
That sounds good. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. So I have to be honest with everybody. This concept of awe is something new for our profession. This is not something that's been implemented in law enforcement. In fact, when you invited me to be a part of this panelist, it really took some time for me to research and see what this is all about. And it has so much promise. And just sitting here today, listening to you, it gives me so much inspiration. So, the biggest challenge we face in law enforcement profession is the mental health of our officers. As leaders in the law enforcement profession, we need to continue to pursue bold new opportunities in helping our employees build resiliency, strengthen officer wellness, right? Our profession is losing, and people don't know, our profession is losing just as many officers to suicide as we all other line of duty deaths combined. So, utilizing Dr. Shiota's research and implementing AWE techniques, that's a bold new approach. And that's what we speak of as leaders. So if we could find ways to reduce trauma for our employees, hopefully we'll be able to help their mental health, build resiliency, and ultimately change outcomes. So again, if I'm being honest, the concept of AWE has surprised me. This is not something that's well known or spoken of in our profession. Knowing that we can use AWE techniques to help reduce trauma for our employees is very promising, and of course exciting for our profession. So how I feel the best to apply and use it is several applications to infuse AWE into our trainings, right? Our daily briefings, our critical stress debriefings, and of course, off-duty counseling sessions. Using imagery and art and even music is something that was worth exploring, and certainly adding the concept of AWE into law enforcement professions. So particularly after like a traumatic event, or even for reduction of PTSD symptoms. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to learn more about this concept. And of course, thank you so much for having me today.
There were a number of questions. That's super helpful. Neil, you're in Pinole?
I am, yes.
You're right up the road. Pinole is beautiful. I love it there. So there were a bunch of questions in the chat as well about PTSD, and it's something we're just starting to look at. But I think there's a lot of promise there, and there's a couple different ways to think about it, right? So one is the evidence that Jenny and I both talked about, that in the moment of awe, it's just this break. Your mind sort of stops processing whatever it was processing before and focuses on something nice, hopefully, and just gives you a chance to breathe, and your body a chance to reset, and your mind a chance to reset. That can be very health-giving. When you're talking about a trauma in the past, whether it's recently experienced or something that's deeper back, it's not something we've investigated as deeply. There's some preliminary work. Dr. Keltner did a study. I don't know whether he talked about it or someone may later on, where he and some colleagues took vets out into an awe-inspiring experience and helped to look at some of what they experienced as the implications for their well-being afterwards. I think some randomized controlled trials are needed that are more digging into how it works and the mechanisms. But the way that I've described awe is it's like a little earthquake in the mind, right? It's this little bit of plasticity to maybe change something that had gotten embedded. And what PTSD does is it takes a traumatic memory and it just says, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this, don't forget this. This was so important. Any little sign that this might happen again, you're going to activate the entire thing over again. And it's an emotional facilitation of memory that exists to help us, but it's backfiring. It's just way too much, to a point where it impairs well-being and functioning. So we'll all have the opportunity, sort of doses of awe kind of followed by therapy. I think that's what a lot of us are thinking right now, that if you use the awe moment to induce that plasticity and then you process whatever it is that you need to process, that might be where the opportunity lies. So we would really be using it strategically in that way.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. Just knowing that we can use this in our profession to help reduce trauma and potentially PTSD is so promising. As leaders in this profession, we really need to do something to increase our resiliency and really help our employees when it comes to mental health. So being that we're so close, I know I'm just going to throw out an offer. We have first responders here, officers that would love to work with you, and maybe we could do something together and partner and collaborate to really bring something to our profession. So very, very excited about your work and just being here and being part of what you're doing.
Let's talk. Yeah.
Let's segue to Dr. Randy Auerbach, and let's hear some of your thoughts on Dr. Steller's presentation. And if you have a question for her.
Thank you for including me. I have to say I was really inspired by both of the talks, and I'm coming from an adjacent field, but something that I don't really think a lot about. I focus on brain behavior markers of depression and suicide in adolescents. And, we're often focusing on the problem and trying to build up inherent strengths in people or figure out what associated resources could be brought to bear to help families and teens overcome some of the many obstacles in their lives. And, it was interesting to think about some of the work that both of you are doing, and in particular with some of the work that Jenny presented, because we're looking, ostensibly at college students, which, they're still obviously developing and they're progressed, but I'm thinking of it more from a developmental perspective in this idea of, the practice of instilling awe or taking the time to develop this is not the right verbiage, so forgive me, like kind of the awe muscles, so to speak, to kind of build up that tool. I would imagine really could start potentially earlier on in the developmental course, and a practice that could be brought to bear through modeling from parents and really taking time. And there's two parts of my adjacent work that I thought about in the context of what both of you are doing, in particular in a developmental lens. On the one hand, technology, brings awe to our fingertips at any moment. But with teenagers, I would also argue at some points that technology is the biggest impasse to awe, in the sense that, how often I'm walking down the streets of Manhattan and there are amazing things, and you just see people kind of buried in their phones. And there's this kind of opportunity cost of just missing out that which is amazing in front of you at all times. And I guess my question is really twofold. On the one hand, how do you foster and cultivate an environment that values awe? And I guess the second question is something that Dr. Shiota just touched on, is awe a treatment, or is it an everyday practice that helps facilitate other kind of interventions broadly? And I know those are probably too big of questions to address in the 6 to 7 minutes, but I think it just maybe underscores how much I really valued both the talks. It really made me think deeply on the subject.
So yeah, we'll try and get both of those in the remaining time. So I do think we can cultivate as societies, awe experiences. We can do a better job, and we can help people access places. Lani mentioned this: nature, even art museums, science museums, aquariums that can help them experience this emotion in their daily lives. And I think that's one of the areas I'm really interested in, is how as a society can we bring nature into people's everyday experiences. So I think that's something we should work on at a societal level. And you do see that in hospitals, actually. People are starting to build in more of these places where you can experience awe just in a very sterile environment like a hospital. Secondly, what was your second question? Now I've forgotten, because it was interventions or everyday life. I think it can be both, right? So I do think building it in as an everyday practice, in the way that, similar to meditation, that you can build it in as an everyday practice, is incredibly useful. For me, that's going out on nature walks. People can pick whatever works for them. And then why can't it also be an intervention? If you can really create these big experiences for people, we know we have them out in the world. Even concerts for a lot of people are like that. We know we're going to go and we're going to have this really effervescent, awe-inspiring experience where we're in a group and we're all having this experience together. So I think a combination is best. And I do think we can utilize them depending on what we want to do. Certainly, if you're working with somebody who has depression, an intervention that they might not be motivated to do, but they experience really positively, could be really useful. And then it could open the door for other interventions that you layer on top of it. I think Lani's right. It's a little earthquake. And the benefit of that is it creates little cracks that you can utilize for promoting healthier cognitive strategies, things like that.
And I think, if anything, we've heard from the many, many things that we heard from both of our expert speakers is awe is more than some just pop psychology catchphrase of when you get a chance, or if you become rich, you get to go see the Northern Lights. It's not like that at all. And I think the research that both of you shared, it's pretty conclusive. There's massive benefits that touch with our well-being and our mental health. And it's also accessible, yet again, everywhere. And that's already a theme that's emerging. And as we heard from the chief and Dr. Auerbach as well, it's the insights that both of you shared. It's just taking a moment to actually literally slow down and just contemplate it. And That's the whole essence of slowing things down as well, whether you call it mindfulness or whatever you want to call it. I just call it looking after yourself. And on that note, I thank each and every one of you being part of this panel. It was fantastic.